Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Authentic You podcast today. I'm very excited to have the lovely Shani Bella here with me today. Hi, Shani. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hello.
So, um, so, so what we can talk about today. So I'm just trying to find Shani's bio. There it is. Okay, so I'm so excited because I've read Shani's bio, and I love what your name means. And Shani shared with us that Shani means scarlet thread, or the woven theme of a story. And like the red thread, she uses her magic to weave people together in community and bring them home to the remembrance of who they truly are. So Shani is a spiritual guide, rebirthing breathwork facilitator, ancestral healer and teacher, and uses the power of rebirthing breathwork, a form of conscious connected breathing, ancestral healing, and a spiritual navigation to support women in awakening their feminine so they can live life on their terms. And Shani holds space for women's circles, cacao ceremonies, and breathing circles each month to provide a sacred space for healing and conscious sisterhood. Incredible, Shani. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm a huge lover of breathwork and cacao myself, so it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Is there anything else that you'd like to add and share with the podcast listeners and viewers? Because I was going to say we're live on YouTube. We're not actually live, but we'll be on YouTube.
Yeah, fantastic. So, it's pronounced Shani, which is fine because loads of people get it wrong all
Oh
the
yeah,
time.
should have asked.
That's okay. And actually, like all my life, I really didn't like my name, Shani, because of that exact reason, because people couldn't read it and pronounce it and write it. And when I was younger, I tried to, this is the Authentically You podcast, but when I was younger, I felt so disconnected from my name, or at least I tried to hide from my name because it made me feel so different to everybody else. So, I always thought, oh, I wish I was called Sophie, or I wish I was called Jessica or Laura or something that was, typically English, that people could read and pronounce and write. And it was only when I moved to Israel, which is where my name is from, Shani, that I finally felt, oh, actually people get my name here. People can say my name. And I finally felt that sense of connection to the ancestry of it and to the roots of it. And I guess up until that point, I was hiding part of my identity and hiding part of my name because it just, it had made me feel uncomfortable all my life. But now I really embrace it, and understanding the meaning of it and the work that I do feels so much more aligned and kind of divinely given now. So I really embrace my name.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. It is a beautiful name. That was what I thought the first time we met online. I thought, what a beautiful name. And it resonates with me, with people saying my name wrong, because I've been on quite a lot of US podcasts, and the name Gemma isn't common in the US. And I get called Gemma. And the amount of podcasts where someone said, okay, Gemma, thanks. And I'm like, Gemma. So yeah, you wouldn't think a name like Gemma would get mispronounced, but it does. And when I was in Holland, it was Gemma. So there we go. Don't know how I did that. Yeah. Okay, amazing. So what led you to this journey, Shani, of doing this incredible work that you're doing? Tell us a little bit about what led you to this.
So all my life, like everybody else, I was always trying to hide who I truly was and trying to be a chameleon and fit in with the crowd. And I always knew I was a little bit different. I always knew I had a little bit of a spark of magic, and I would always have crazy dreams. I still remember my dreams from being a child that I've later dealt with as past life regressions. I remember making up my own language to write in my diary. And now I work with light language. So I've always kind of had these connections to these things, but didn't really know what they were, or how to use them in any kind of magical capacity. And I had a series of really traumatic events happen to me when I was 22, which I think was probably the start of my spiritual awakening, but I just didn't really know it then. I was in an abusive relationship that I had to leave and take to court and go through a lot of really difficult things with that. And in the same year, I had a really terrible car crash where I was cut out of the car. And I ended up flying to America, and then the volcano in Iceland erupted, so I got stuck in America. And it was just a whole series of really difficult events that took place. I was a teacher at that time. I just started my teaching career. My colleague had died in a car accident, and then my head teacher passed away about 6 months later. So I just had a whole year of 22, 23 of just really deep, difficult things to handle. And that's kind of when I started to find alternative holistic ways of healing. But still, I didn't really know that was my spiritual awakening. I kind of was had a tendency to run away, and always felt like a lack of belonging to places, always felt like I wasn't from wherever I was. And I am of mixed heritage. I have, Israeli, Egyptian, Algerian, Bulgarian in me from my grandparents, and my father. But I've never really felt a belonging to any one specific place. And then I moved to Asia when I was 25 for a teaching job. And there I very much found myself living in a world that was very materialistic, capitalistic, very masculine, competitive, very regimented. And I remember before going to Singapore, my best friend who still lives there and works there from primary school, he said to me, like, I think you'll hate it. You're far too arty and creative and flowing and feminine for this place. And he was right to a huge extent. I did find myself really struggling in a place like that. But what it brought me was the gateway to other cultures and experiences. And I remember the first time I went to Sri Lanka, going to this temple ritual, and I just something woke up in me then, and I knew that there was more to it at this point. And I kept visiting all the temples around Asia, and I started to connect, and it was kind of a really clear message at that point, like, you need to go and find your roots, you need to go and find where you come from, like with the name, story I told you at the beginning. So after almost 5 years of living in Singapore, I moved to Israel, where I'm half English, half Israeli. And it was there that my spiritual awakening really ramped up, because I was on the land of my ancestors, and I was on the land of my Egyptian lineage. And that's when, that's the land where I was deeply then connected to the Magdalene, to Christ consciousness, and all of that dropped in. And when I moved to Israel first, it was everything I wanted it to be. It was like creative and flowy, and it was the opposite of where I lived in Asia. It had no order. It was total chaos and spontaneous and unorganized. And I kind of liked that at the beginning. It was what I needed. I found friends, and I had a partner and all the rest of it. And then slowly, the same things kept coming back in, like the masculine energy, the mistrust of the masculine, the mistrust of like deep masculine wounding, all related around my father, who's from Israel. And someone recommended me to go and see a breath worker. I was still dealing with PTSD from the car accident, from the abusive relationship, from just being so frozen in my body, and someone recommended breath work to me. So I went to see a breath worker, and I went to quite a number of sessions with her. And then through her, I discovered women's circles. I started going to a women's circle, and I remember the first time I ever sat in a women's circle, I finally felt at home. I think it was the first time in my life I felt like, oh, I feel so heard, I feel so understood, I feel so held. And then from that, I started just to go to cacao ceremonies, ecstatic dance retreats. I went to a breathwork retreat, I held some space on a breathwork retreat, and it just became so obvious to me that that's what I needed to train in. It changed my life so much. And I was on a channeling course, a channeling journey in Israel with a group of women, and I just kept getting all these messages and these synchronicities, and I was opening up my psychic gift, and it was just coming in more and more and more. And I kept getting the letter J coming through, and I remember writing in my journal, I'm going to marry someone beginning with the letter J. And at the time, my boyfriend, his name began with an M, so I was like, right, definitely not him. And 2 years later, I did meet my current partner, whose name is Joshua.
Amazing.
Yeah, one begins with a J. And within 5 minutes of meeting me, he said, I see you, you're a Magdalene. And I was like, who are you? And then when he finally told me his name, he was like, Joshua. And I was like, oh, like, Joshua, what? And and I told him the story about writing the letter J.
Magic.
And it's just been like opening after opening after opening since then. I got all the signs to go where I needed to go. I did my breathwork training in India, in Rishikesh. In November of 2019, I got a very clear message that I needed to leave Israel. And when I asked Spirit, like, when do I need to leave? The word that came out of my mouth in physical form just went March, as in March of 2020.
Oh my goodness, chills.
Yeah, and I actually left on February 29th.
Wow.
It was a leap year. I left, I flew to England for about 3 days, went off to India, did my breathwork training. Before that, just when I got the message March and I knew I wanted to go to breathwork, to do breathwork, I kept also getting India in my messages. And then on LinkedIn, when I had my teacher's LinkedIn, some random guy contacted me asking me if I was interested in a job in a school in India. And it was just like all of these kinds of things, because, all the synchronicities were happening. And when I started my breathwork training, it was on the 6th of March in India. So it was just meant to be that way. And then, of course, the world stopped and I was stuck in Rishikesh, and all my beautiful plans for traveling around India and around these other countries that I'd had planned didn't happen. I ended up back in the UK. I had to move in with my mum and dad because I hadn't lived here for 10 years. I had no residency, and if you want to talk about your next level of spiritual awakening, then move back in with your parents. So all of the work I'd done on my father wounding and the trusting of the masculine in Israel continued when I moved in. And that was kind of the next step of my evolution, really. And then from there, it was finding my community here. And I literally moved to Norfolk, and I didn't know anybody, not one person. I didn't have a car. Didn't have a job. I didn't have, anything. And it was that period of time where you weren't told you weren't allowed to see anybody. And so it was just me in a village. I grew up in London, lived in Singapore, Tel Aviv, and then this tiny little village in Norfolk where I didn't know a soul and or anyone at all. And it was just a matter of creating community. And I knew that, the power of sisterhood circles and my journey with them and the breath work and my journey with it. And I absolutely knew that I had to recreate that. And here we are.
Amazing. Oh,
story.
And I love that. I always call that, like, your experiences in your early 20s is like the universal dump truck, isn't it? It's like you get sent the feathers, you don't notice the feathers, then the brick comes, and then it's like, right, no, you're aligning now, we're going to do this. So yeah, definitely resonates with my story as well. So that's amazing. And what an incredible journey you've been on, like actually, like physically as well as emotionally, spiritually, mentally, like in that process. So yeah,
and
so
it continues. I mean, it's no coincidence that I now currently live in Norwich, and on my road is Mary Magdalene Church, and I live, right close to Magdalene Street. And I was like, well, she'll find me wherever I go, like it's not a joke. So I discovered her on the lands in which, and my grandmother actually comes from the village where she was said to have been born as well, in northern Israel. And I did a bit of a pilgrimage to the north of Israel on my own before I left to connect with all of that and the lands there. And then it's just deepened. It just keeps on deepening. So the gifts just keep on opening, and things have dropped in, like the light language. One day when I was just doing the washing up in the kitchen, it just dropped in, and I started speaking a funny language. I didn't know what it was.
I love that you're just doing the washing up. Like, that's amazing.
Washing up in the kitchen.
And is that not just like a message for anyone listening in that you don't have to be sat meditating for 4 hours for your gifts to come out? Like, you're just in alignment and it's like, bam, okay, right, this is happening. So yeah. I love that. So the question I'm dying to ask is, tell me more about birth script. I would love to know, like, tell us more about the work that you do.
Yeah, so specifically with rebirthing breathwork, it was discovered by a man named Leonard Orr, and he first discovered rebirthing breathwork when he was breathing in the bath. And he had a regression to being back in the womb, and it was something, to do with the warm water. And I know we had a chat before the podcast that I gave one of my clients a warm water rebirth this morning in the bath, which is a whole other experience to like doing the rebirthing on land, which is also super powerful. But in the water, it adds this extra remembrance or cellular memory. And so one of the things that I work with when I give breathwork sessions is what's known as the birth script. And we all have a birth script. It's different to your birth story. Your birth story might be like, I was born at this time, at this hospital, via C-section. I weighed this amount. Most people know kind of the basics of their birth story. And then the birth story might go a little bit deeper with things like beliefs that you might be holding on to from what your mother shared with you or your father shared with you. I almost died giving birth to you, or you were a really easy birth, you shot straight out, or gosh, you were so much harder than your sister, or whatever it was, right? So these are the parts of the story. But the birth script goes back before that. So your birth script, really it's ancestral, because we know that we carry the cellular memory of your mother, your grandmother, and whilst your mother is forming in your grandmother's womb, you're already kind of being formed within the eggs of that. So it's really interesting. But when your birth script kind of starts with the conception, so most people don't know how they were conceived. It's not really a question you ask your parents. And there's already an imprint from that moment, right? So if you were conceived in a really intentional, conscious way, where both parents wanted this baby and they created some kind of space and intention for that to come through, and they called it in and they did it in this really loving way, you're going to have a totally different imprint to somebody who was, say, sexually assaulted, or somebody who was a teenage, got pregnant in their teens and didn't necessarily plan for it, or you were a surprise pregnancy, or there was a sense of guilt, like, oh, I need to have a baby now because I'm getting to a certain age, or whatever it is, or your partner wanted one and you didn't, or whatever it was, there's an imprint from the conception. And then obviously throughout your time in the womb, there are a whole host of different things going on. And your mother's taken on the birth script from her birth and the birth stories that she's heard. And then it continues, right? So, say the mother has lost a baby before you're in the womb, they've had a miscarriage, or they gave birth to a child that didn't survive, or whatever it is. Their experience of that pregnancy is going to be so different to somebody else. Or maybe there's an illness, or maybe there's a story or a belief that they are carrying, or maybe they planned for a conscious birth and they ended up having to have an emergency cesarean. There are all sorts of factors. And then there's the birth itself and how you come into this world. And I can share a bit about my own birth script in a bit, and some examples of how that then affects some patternings of behavior that you might have in your life. But yeah, the way that you come into the world, and then you take your first breath. And usually that breath is a breath of fear, the scream of the baby. And particularly if they're born into a hospital setting where there's lots of bright lights and loud noises and people in masks and textures that don't feel good on a baby's skin. And it can just feel really overwhelming and stimulating. And then it depends whether they're able to bond with the mother or they're taken away. There's so many factors. Forceps babies often complain of having migraines, headaches, kind of attacks around the crown. And induced babies are often really punctual, really on time, like very quick, need to be everywhere very quickly, need to move through life very quickly. So there's a whole kind of host of different things that play out according to your birth script. So it is different to the birth story. They're interlinked, but I think the birth script is more in depth. And often with the birth script, like, you take on vows or promises that you don't even know that you've taken on, and you play them out throughout your life and you don't even know it. And we kind of work through that in the breathwork sessions to rewrite the script.
Amazing. So that sounds incredible, and it just makes so much sense, doesn't it? Like I feel sort of I feel a lot of us have a deep knowing with that, like the way that we come into this world and being in the womb and all of that, like that it impacts on us. And I remember doing some, actually it was through breath work, thinking about this. It was like the first or second breathwork session I'd ever been on before I trained in it myself. Different, obviously different type of breathwork to what you do, but similar principle in terms of breathing and oxygenating and everything. And I went back to my inner child, and then I suddenly had an awareness that I was in the womb and that I was sending back healing to that version of myself. So yeah, so incredibly powerful. So what does tell us a little bit about what it actually entails in terms of a session, and how does it affect, in particular, tell us more about how it affects us now in our patterns of behavior.
I'll start with the patterns of behavior, and then I'll kind of outline what a session might look like, because it's different for everybody, obviously. So for example, my mum lost a baby before me. She gave birth to a baby that didn't survive. And I've obviously worked through my birth script on various occasions through my own breathwork sessions, through my breathwork training, and then just actually it's just dropped in random experiences as well, which I'll share a bit about. But when I was next in the womb, I feel like I've never really had a connection to grief. I've never really thought about death. I don't think about death, like, ever. I don't fear it. It's not something that doesn't play on my mind in any way. And I often wonder if it's because that was already experienced before I came in, like whether that grief and that death kind of experience already happened. But as a result of mum having to have an emergency cesarean with that baby, I was then a planned cesarean baby. Me and my brother both were. And I didn't get to choose when I came into this world, right? Someone else chose it for me. They planned it in advance. And I don't know that I was ready to come in. I was 3 weeks early. I put that in inverted commas for the podcast listeners, because I don't believe due dates are accurate. And I also don't believe, like, the baby decides, right? The baby knows when it's ready to come. Unless there's like a real medical emergency, then the baby knows, because it's a natural physiological process. But I came out earlier than I, necessarily should have. And I definitely have, like, always struggled with arriving on time to things. Like, I've definitely struggled. I feel a resentment to arriving to places at particular times. If someone else set the time, if I set the time, it's slightly different. Someone else sets the time, I do have, like, not a conscious resentment of it, but it's definitely like a subconscious resentment of it. And I also just, I feel like, hang on, I didn't get sovereign choice over this. Like, I don't, why are you scheduling me in for this time? So there's that. And I know a lot of planned cesarean babies feel the same way. Whereas, like, induced babies, like I said to you before, they're usually like the punctual ones. They're anxious about not being on time. They're always early. They're kind of highly strung around, like, panic about being late or letting people down, or so there's like a real imprint of that. And then on a deeper, more like shamanic level, the baby that was born before me, his name was Daniel. They named him Daniel. And I had 2 very, very toxic relationships with 2 men named Daniel in my lifetime, both of whom said that they liked being in my energy because it was motherly. They both said it. And they both sucked so much energy from me. They both depleted me, in fact, to the point where I was actually physically quite sick. Like, I was unwell after being in their presence. And I had horrible other kind of attacks happen to me after that, like energetic attacks happened to me, that I really felt that it was connected to that baby that had been lost before me.
Sounds like a trauma bond on, like, a really early level, because we normally, like, think of trauma bonds as being connected to kind of parenting. It sounds like for you that trauma bond was that womb connection. That's amazing.
Yeah, obviously I'm a highly sensitive being, and I'm an empath, and I probably did take on the imprint of not only my mum's anxiety, but the like the guilt of like he never got to be part of this earth, right? He never got to be a part of the family. And that kind of appeared later on as well, when I moved back to the UK and I moved back in with my mum and my dad, and I'd been doing all this work on father wounding. My dad, bless him, would just like, he would talk about me, but like over me to my mum at the table as if I wasn't there. So we would physically be sitting at the table eating dinner, and he'd ask my mum, how was Shani's day? And I'm like, Dad, I'm literally sitting next to you. Like, would you ask me how my day was? And he would address my mum in a room, but not me. And I kept feeling like, well, I'm just not being seen. Like, I'm not seen. And like this kept playing out in relationships as well. Like I just wasn't being seen. I wasn't being heard. And I just fell into it, and I was like, I think someone in my family wasn't seen. Like, it's not me. I don't know what's going on. I just knew it like intuitively. And I asked my mum, did you ever get to see the baby, Daniel? And she said, no, they took him away before either of us could see him. And I just knew in that moment. And I sat like in a kind of a conversation with the baby, and I just said, you have to stop. Like, you are stopping me from having the relationship that I want just because you didn't get it, and it's not okay. And it was like a real kind of like energetic shift in the relationship between my dad and I at that point. A small part of the bigger healing. And then when I was at a festival last summer, we were in this big tent, and I've always struggled with like loud noises and bright lights, and I just get quite overwhelmed by it. Just sensitive, right? That's part of it. But this tent in the festival, it was open-sided, so that you weren't trapped in the tent, but it had like these psychedelic paintings on the ceiling, and there was like laser lights and smoke machines. And then the musician who was playing, he's a medicine man. He does kind of medicine music, and it's very activating. And as soon as he started playing, I just felt my heart starting to beat. And this was at a conscious, sober festival. And all I could hear around me was people talking about drugs, like not even plant-based drugs, like drugs, hardcore drugs. And it was all I could hear. It's like over the music, that was all I could hear. And there was the bright lights and the blazers and the smoke and the talk of the drugs. I could hear it. And I closed my eyes, and I just had that regression to being born, like in a hospital, cesarean, doctors talking, bright lights, talking about drugs, drips, I just could see it all. And I had a panic, and I felt so overwhelmed. I was like, I have to leave the space. And I left the tent after about 5 minutes. I cried and I cried and I cried, like held myself and I cried, and I left. I went to find a place to lie down, and I must have fallen asleep. The woman, it was like in a little cafe tent thing, and the woman woke me up and was like, we're closing the cafe now. So I just like 5 minutes in that space, and I was exhausted. And then the last thing that I've connected with is when I did my doula training last year, because I was just curious to do some training to like know more about the birth stories and the birth scripts. So I did a doula training last year in conscious birthing. And when they spoke about epidurals, I just conked out on the sofa. Like, I literally blanked out. And I woke up about 10 minutes later, and I said, we finished talking about epidurals now? And they're like, yeah, we've moved on. And I was like, oh my goodness, my mum must have had an epidural. I didn't know it. I was like, she must have had an epidural. Yeah. It's like my body's cellular memory remembered what it was like to numb out from the medicine. And then I texted my mom and said, did you have an epidural with me? And she was like, yeah, you were a planned C-section. Of course I did. And I was like, well, I didn't know, of course. Like, I was just learning about all these things. It wasn't obvious to me at all until that moment. And so these things do have a cellular imprint on us more than we know. And that's just part of my birth script.
There's something that you've touched on there, Shani, that just like gave me chills, and I got my sort of truth tears coming in, and I feel like, and it was about me, but now I've kind of broadened that out and gone, hang on a moment, there's something bigger here. So when you said about like, there's a couple of things you said. So I was born C-section as well, like something about not being ready to come into the world. So I've always felt like I don't belong here, like I'm too, sorry, cat's making noise now, he always likes to come and make an appearance. You know, I don't belong here, I'm really different, like all that. I've had to like deal with all of that kind of wounding and traumas. And then when you said about like your experience at the festival, I was like, wow, that's like so true for me as well. I actually had an experience at a festival. It was less kind of instant, but it was more of a build up. So you know, I was there during the day and it was lovely, and it was like quite chilled and relaxed during the day. You know, sat on the grass, watched some music, things like this. And then as the evening went on, more and more people arrived, it got busier and busier, and gradually my senses got so overwhelmed. And this unfortunately was a drinking festival. I said I'm gonna like avoid the like alcohol festivals from now on. And yeah, I had that moment of like my body just shut down. And it was like, get out, it's like there's a fire. Like when you were saying, I was like, that totally resonated with me. And I feel there's something, maybe because I know a lot of listeners are highly sensitive, and that's, you know, that's kind of what we work on a lot, is around the high sensitivity piece and the gifts of being highly sensitive. And I'm wondering if there was a truth, like I felt complete truth and resonance in my body around, like, you know, you're pulled out of the womb and there's suddenly bright lights. I wonder how many of us that are highly sensitive have had that experience.
Mm.
And I'm just like, there's something, I've got like, I feel like I've got a light bulb on.
Mm.
I feel like there's something
Yeah.
here about sensitivity and maybe even like neurodivergence as a whole, and how this links to the birth story. I feel like there's a real truth. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. It's definitely, I wish it would be so amazing
I
if there
wish we
was,
had some data.
yeah, if there was like
Scientists
research
in me.
out there. I mean, there is research out there on, I'd like to explore a little bit more, but research out there on, they did some experiments on women who were pregnant during Nazi Germany, and like the difference in the children that were born at that time. And, you know, I think it's going to be the same in the last 2 years. I think the children that are coming through now are going to be totally different, you know, to the children that came through before, because of what they've had to experience being in the womb. And like, I know women that gave birth in the last 2 years who, you know, it's traumatizing. Like, they weren't allowed to see their own babies in the hospital. Like, they were separated, or they had to wear a mask or whatever it was. That just, you know, that initial bond with the baby, and like the kind of fear that they put in women, like during that time, and the separation. I think we're going to see a whole generation of something going on.
Yeah, we're all going to be needed. Everyone listening, bring the
Yeah,
healers and therapists. Like, we're going to need you.
yeah,
Come forward. You're feeling
absolutely.
this is your calling. Come forward now, because you're going to be needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, definitely. I think, you know, there is something about the way that a woman gives birth, and the way that the child is brought into this world. And you can just see it, like when you watch birth videos of like ecstatic births, or, you know, mums that are able to give birth in the water, you know, the water is what we were born and created in the waters. And, you know, if we're coming out into the dry and into that stark environment in a hospital, it's just, oh,
I
I
was
don't know.
born in the old Norfolk and Norwich. That was just yuck.
That's where you were born.
Yeah, the old Norfolk and Norwich, not the one that's there now. Yeah, it was just like tower block. Just,
Oh, wow.
oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, I think I think we need to talk more about this, because I feel like as I'm talking to you, I'm like, wow, I'd love to know more about like my
Yeah. I
birth
mean,
story.
you
Yeah.
know, there's like, you know, you look at like, there's research about women who like sing to their babies in the womb, and then that child like knows that song, like they just know it, or they can play it when they, you know, it's just, you just know how deeply it's affecting the baby inside. Like, we're interlinked so deeply in that way. How can it not?
Amazing. But what I love about your story and the work that you do, Shani, is that authenticity angle of like, you knew that, I almost like feeling you, like you knew there was more to life, and you went out and explored it, and asked questions, and then the universe just put in front of you like where you needed to go, and then through that you found this real connection with who you are and yourself, and have been able to kind of, I think this is an important part of authenticity, I feel, that doesn't get spoken about a lot. You know, we hear like just be yourself, but actually it's more than that. It's about almost like recoding yourself back to soul, because, and that is a huge part of authenticity, because we're born like, when our soul comes in, we are authentic, and then suddenly from that moment all the things that happen to us bring us out of alignment and out of authenticity. So like if we just went along like trying to think of an example, like a train on a track, if we just carried on like that, actually wouldn't, it'd be authentic for where we were at right now, but it wouldn't be authentic on a soul alignment level. And that's what I'm hearing in your story, is that like you've got in touch with who you deeply are on that soul alignment level, because you've gone right back and have done that healing, which I think is incredible work to bring to the world, and it's so needed. So
it still continues, right? Like you think you've done one layer, well, you have done one layer, and then
the onion. Yeah,
you, and you're like, well, did I learn that lesson then? Is that you know, stripping it back? And then depending on how deep you want to go, you know, I don't know how deeply your listeners connect to these things, but
deep, we go deep.
okay, so like on multi-dimensional levels, you know, like it's not just about this lifetime. We've got all the traumas that we've lived in this lifetime. There's all the past lifetimes, parallel lifetimes, different universes, wherever we've lived or come from. And yeah, like, you know, my deep connection to ancient Egypt, it's like, well, yeah, of course, because my grandmother was Egyptian in my actual lifetime, but because I know I come from the stars, and I know 100% like I'm Lyran or Lyran, however you want to pronounce it. Like when I got my cat, I've never had a cat, and since I've had my cat, I'm like, I get her. Like I look at her and I'm like, you, I think we're related. Like, and
I'm the same with my cat, but I've had him for, he's 13, and when I first had him, I just wasn't like awakened to this stuff at all, but I always knew like that we had some kind of connection, so that totally resonates. Yeah,
and it's, you know, and then it's like, oh, it makes so much sense why I lived in hot countries and why I struggle so much in the UK. It's just, it's so earthy and watery here, and I really need like sun and solar, and I'm always dressed in like oranges, and I love gold and orange and warmth and sun and solar energy. Like I'm not a moon person at all. And yeah, and it's like the longer I've been back in the UK, the more my soul feels that longing to go back home.
yeah.
This is the physical home where I was born, but it doesn't feel like a home to me. It is in some respects, but like my soul, like my physical body is here right now, but my soul definitely longs for like the desert winds and the desert plains and the pyramids and the sun, and like that's just the food. All of that is like my whole face changes when I talk about it. I can see it.
So you're really lit up. And I really associate you with orange now as well. Like whenever I see like your posts, and I can even see like your house and you're like everything, like it just really, it's really you. It's like, it's your brand. It's I love it.
Yeah, I just think, well, I lived in the desert as a kid, and I love the desert. I love, you know, when I think about breath work and the air and the winds, I think like I always joke like I'm a bit like a mystical Mary Poppins. I'm like, oh, I just like, I arrive, shake some stuff up, and then I like, you know, wherever the wind takes me next sort of thing. And I don't want to be tied down to a specific place, because I don't think that's how I work. I'm oracular. I'm, you know, I have a psychic ability, and I don't think I'm meant to be necessarily in one place for long periods of time. And I've always beat myself up a little bit about like, why am I always trying to find a new place to go, and why can't I just settle in one place? And then I'm like, maybe I'm not meant to, and it's okay. Like, it's okay.
It's okay, which comes with that authenticity and acceptance again, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like we're told that's what we're supposed to do, but why? Like, why? That's just society's expectation of what we're supposed to do. Like, yeah, I very much like want to live more of a nomadic life, and this is being back in England now for 3 years, almost 3 years now, like it was really good for grounding, especially after I lived abroad for so long. Like it was really good to be grounded in one place, but my soul is always like, ooh, where can I go? Yeah.
Amazing. So there's probably so much in this question, but I always ask my guests, if you were to give one tip to being their most authentic self, if you can narrow it down to one, what would you say?
For me, it's always about using your discernment. I think that is like my number one tip, is using your discernment. And I think when you are spiritually awakening, and this is something I'm just kind of working on a new 4-week journey for women who are coming into their awakening, but at the very beginning, and it feels really overwhelming and they don't know where to go and what to do. And I remember that time, like I told you in my story, I was like, I don't know where to go or what to do. I didn't even know these things existed. And when I'm kind of pulling out for like, what do I want these women to experience in this 4-week journey when they're first starting to awaken? It's the biggest thing I want them to learn is how to use their discernment.
Oh my gosh, that's exactly what I would say, Shani, as well. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh, yes. Yeah.
Because you know, when you come into an awakening journey, it's so easy to get distracted by the crystals and the Reiki and all the like kind of the moon circles and all of the things. And it's so easy
All
to,
the shiny objects over here, and which we're going to have another conversation about
yeah,
the dark
definitely.
side another day, aren't we? Because I think
Yeah.
there's some stuff that needs to be shared there. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an amazing tip.
Yeah. I think like, you know, when you first start, because I remember it myself, and like when you first start to awaken, it's scary, but it's exciting. It's like the start of a new journey, like, oh, I've never known these things, and oh my goodness. And then it becomes difficult.
Yeah.
If you don't have discernment at that point,
Yeah.
you can easily get swept away and energetically depleted and burnt out and overwhelmed and caught up with the wrong people. And you know, who do you choose as someone to help you with healing? You know, who do you choose, what modalities? All of these things, there's so much out there now, there's so much available. It's confusing, I think, for a lot of people. I think it's overwhelming. And really, unless you know how to use your discernment to come back to your own truth, then you're always going to be kind of living a life that's not quite yours. And so that would be my biggest tip.
Thank you, Shani. That's incredible, and thank you for the work that you do and what you bring in terms of the discernment piece and in terms of teaching that, getting that out there. I think it's really important. So we've come to the end of the podcast today, and it's been amazing, and I could talk to you for hours. But we do have to end it here. So how can we get in touch with you? Is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners and our viewers? I'll also pop your details in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at _Shani Bella, so SHANIBELLA, but I'm sure you'll see it in the show notes. My website is available, which I know you're going to put in the show notes as well, www.shanibellacoaching.co.uk, which is weird. And again, talk about authenticity. I chose that name, that title with the coaching when I first started. It feels so out of alignment for me now. But I want to find the right new name for it, which is taking me time because I want to really like be truthful.
Embody it.
You can find me on Facebook. I have a free WhatsApp group called the Sacred Sisterhood Circles, which you can join for really lovely community connection. It's not a space for like spammy adverts. It's a place for actual connection and community. No one's allowed to advertise in there. I share my events in there. Obviously, it's my group, but yeah, I don't allow people just to make it a notice board because that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for community connection. If you are local to Norwich or Norfolk or even Suffolk, I run monthly women's circles and cacao ceremonies, as you said at the beginning, here in this lovely room.
It's a lovely room.
It's a lovely room. I run breathwork journeys online. I have one-to-one sessions obviously available as well. And I run an event at a place called Norwich Yoga Central every 2 months called Awaken Your Inner Goddess, which is like a much bigger, more immersive event where I have local female-owned businesses coming to sell their beautiful products and share their gifts. So it was like jewelry and crystals and ceramics and all sorts of beautiful stuff, homemade products. Always a chance for you to be pampered with some massages. We had an Indian head massage and reflexology last weekend. I ran the last one. And then we had ecstatic dance, meditation, sound healing, breath work, and we have a raffle which all the people donate prizes to, and then the money from the raffle goes to the Magdalene Group, which is a charity locally to here. Of course, the Magdalene Group supports women who have been sexually exploited and abused, and so that whole event is just a female empowerment event to support all the people coming, and it's been amazing each time. And the next one will be on June 24th.
Amazing.
Join.
Thank you so much, Shani. Sounds absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for being my guest. And yeah, go check out Shani's stuff. Your circles sound absolutely amazing. And yeah, thanks for having you. Thanks for having you. That's a new one.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for coming. Right, we'll end it there. Thanks, Shani.
Thank you.